Hey folks, this is an example video in section 4.3. I would consider the question I'm about to do for you probably the climax of the whole entire semester. So if you would go all the way down to the very last question in this particular section, it's going to be example 9, but I want to stop and take a look at the directions first. It tells us that first we should list all of our possible zeros. You had a video on that. It also says that we should find all of our rational zeros, which means your actual zeros. And then thirdly, we should go ahead and factor our polynomial. So here's example 9, and part of what makes this ugly is that we've got these fractions involved. So the very first thing that we want to do is we want to get rid of our fractions. The common denominator here is 7, so what we'll want to do is multiply on both sides by that common denominator of 7. So on the left side, you'll have 7 times p of x. I know that looks odd, but this will have the exact same zeros as the original polynomial. And then on the other side, I'm going to distribute to all of my terms. So when I distribute to all of my terms, I'll get the following polynomial. So then the next step is to get our possibles, and we know that the way that we do that from your previous video is that you need to get the factors of the constant. Well, over here, the constant is -5, so our factors here are going to be a 1 and a 5. And we're going to divide by the factors of the leading coefficient, which are 1, 2, 5, and 10. Now, I've written it improperly first. I've got a 1 and a 5 up in the numerator, and I'm going to divide by a 1, a 2, a 5, and a 10. And I need to do all of these individually. So the method I'm going to take here is, first thing I'm going to do is plus or minus the 1 divided by the 1. And then the next is plus or minus the 1 divided by the 2. And then the 1 divided by the 5. And then the 1 divided by the 10, etc., etc., etc. And so 1 divided by 2 plus or minus, and then we also have plus or minus 1 divided by 5 and plus or minus 1 divided by 10. Now do the exact same thing for the 5 that's on top. So we'll have a plus or minus 5 divide 1, a plus or minus 5 divide 2, a plus or minus 5 divide 5, but wait a second, we already have that one, we don't need to write it down again. And a plus or minus 5 divide 10, we already have that one as well. We don't need to write that one down. So I'm only going to write down plus minus 5 halves. So now you know this is the time that you're going to go to the calculator according to the video that I've given you on this. So you go to the calculator and go ahead and graph your polynomial. Now you can either graph the original that has the fractions, that's probably the safer thing to do, or you can graph the new polynomial that you got when you got rid of your fractions. They both have the same set of zeros. So I've got here a graph of my polynomial, and you'll notice that I have 4 zeros, 4 x-intercepts. So 4 x-intercepts then, let's see if we can make a good guess. I can't tell about the ones that are on the outside of the 2, so I'm not going to deal with those, but it looks like the 2 in here could match up with 2 of our possibles. So if you go back to your possibles list, I want to try an x equals a 1/2 first of all. So let's try x equals 1/2. We'll go ahead and make a list of our coefficients. I am going to use the pretty numbers here, not the fractions. And this is what you should have. Again, you know how to do synthetic substitution by now, and this one does work out for us. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back, and I'm also going to try a 1/5. All right, so if I try a 1/5, pause the video, see if you can do the synthetic substitution on this one on your own. All right, if you're back, then you'll find that 1/5 works here as well. And not only that, I'm now left with a quadratic, and I can just solve my quadratic. So before I start solving my quadratic, let's go ahead and make a list of the 2 zeros that we did find, and then we'll go ahead and start solving my quadratic. I would use the square root property here because there's only one variable, so I just need to isolate that one variable. You can pause the video and isolate that variable. All right, you should have gotten plus or minus square root of 5, so I can go ahead and make a list there as well. So I now have all 4 of my zeros. It's not a surprise that I got 4 zeros since my degree was 4. Going back up to the directions, we were supposed to find the possibles. I did that. We were also supposed to find the actual zeros, the 4 that I just found. And then the last thing is that we want to factor. So let's take all 4 of our zeros and let's turn them into factors. Once we turn them into factors, then I can write them as a product of factors. Now I'm almost finished, but there is one last thing that we need to take care of. Remember that the leading coefficient of your factors needs to match the leading coefficient of the original equation. The original leading coefficient was 10/7. And so right now, your leading coefficient does not match. So the very last thing that we need to do is we need to slap a 10/7 in there. And once we've done that, we are completely finished with factoring our polynomial.